The Dark Age of Slavery in Africa. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade began in the early 15th century, primarily driven by European colonial powers such as Portugal, Spain, England, and France. They sought labor to cultivate their expanding colonies in the Americas, and Africa became their primary source. Why Africa? Initially, Europeans sought gold and spices in Africa. However, as the demand for labor in the New World grew, particularly for cultivating sugar, tobacco, and cotton, they turned to Africa for a labor source due to existing systems of slavery within African societies, geographic proximity, and the labor's perceived physical endurance. European and African collaboration. It is essential to note that African leaders and traders often participated in this system. Some African kingdoms, like the Ashanti and Dahomey, engaged in the trade, exchanging captives for European goods, including firearms and textiles. But many Africans resisted, with some kingdoms and leaders, such as Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Congo, fighting against the trade. The horrors of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage refers to the voyage across the Atlantic, during which millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas in horrific conditions. This phase of the trade became one of the most infamous parts of human history due to its sheer brutality. Inhumane conditions. Captives were packed tightly in the holds of ships, often chained together. The conditions aboard the ships were unsanitary, leading to disease outbreaks, malnutrition, and high mortality rates. Historians estimate that about 12 to 15 million Africans were transported, with as many as 2 million dying during the passage. Psychological and cultural impact. Imagine being torn from your homeland, separated from your family, and thrust into an alien world. This was the lived reality of countless African men, women, and children. Despite this, Africans carried their cultural practices, languages, and beliefs with them, planting the seeds of African identity in the diaspora. The impact on African societies. The effects of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa were deep and far-reaching, touching every aspect of African life. Population decline and economic disruption. The trade stripped Africa of millions of its most able-bodied individuals, stunting population growth and destabilizing economies that were dependent on labor. The focus on capturing and selling people shifted resources from agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade. Wars and political instability. African societies were torn apart by conflict as European weapons fueled wars between kingdoms. Those who participated in the slave trade became powerful, while others, who resisted, were destroyed or weakened. Cultural erosion and displacement. With the loss of so many people, African cultures and traditions were fragmented. Yet, remarkably, despite centuries of hardship, African identity, languages, music, and spiritual practices survived and evolved in new forms across the diaspora. Resistance and resilience. While the transatlantic slave trade is often seen through the lens of oppression, it's also a story of resistance and resilience. Africans resisted the trade in numerous ways. Rebellions and escapes. Africans resisted aboard slave ships and in the New World. Famous revolts, like the Amistad Rebellion, along with countless lesser-known acts of defiance, demonstrate their refusal to be enslaved quietly. Cultural survival. Despite the best efforts of slave traders and plantation owners, African cultures persisted. In the Americas, African spiritual practices, such as Vodou in Haiti, Candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba, blended with European and indigenous beliefs, creating rich new traditions. Abolition movements. Both Africans and their descendants played a key role in abolition movements, with figures like Olaudah Equiano, Toussaint Louverture, and Harriet Tubman contributing to the eventual dismantling of the trade. The legacy of the slave trade in modern Africa and the diaspora. The transatlantic slave trade's legacy continues to shape African societies and the African diaspora today. Social and economic inequalities. The trade left African societies vulnerable to colonization, which continued to exploit the continent's resources and people. The economic damage and societal upheavals of the trade are still felt in some regions today. Diaspora and African identity. Across the Americas, descendants of African slaves have shaped new identities, contributing to global culture in areas like music, jazz, blues, reggae, cuisine, and political movements. The story still resounds through corridors of time,